One of the disappointing parts of a story is when it ends. We can lay awake wondering what happens past the point of where we left, but little is known for sure. We're simply left wondering if happily ever after is truly the case. I think this is why Frieren is so captivating as a show. Technically, the show is called Frieren Beyond Journey's End, allowing us to explore a story that literally begins at the end. And the idea of it all beginning at the end is the whole focus. Frieren is a story about grief and loss. It's about confronting the end as we continue to move past whatever ever after is. Frieren is an elf blessed with a very long life. She joins up with a group of adventurers determined to take down the Demon King, whose demons are destroying villages and killing people as they destroy life all around them. Frieren, Himmel, Eisen, and Hyder together kill the Demon King. And this is where the story starts. 50 years after the defeat of the Demon King, Frieren has been spending her time traveling around and gathering spells. When she comes back to visit the capital, she finds Himmel very different to how she left him. He's now old, as is everyone she traveled with. Her companions begin to die out, and Frieren is faced with the realization of a very long life. Much of Frieren as a show is about death and grief, not just for Frieren herself, but also all of her new companions are also dealing with grief. For Frieren, she's obviously dealing with the loss of her companions. Fern, her foster father, who was also Frieren's companion Hyder. Their frontline fighter Stark lost his whole family in a demon attack on his village. Grief is central to the story, constantly giving us characters who are grappling with grief in a variety of ways and understanding themselves in the world in slightly different perspectives. Frieren has her issues issues with grief. Being an elf gifted with long life, she had long seen herself as somehow outside of the humans she interacted with. They were almost like houseflies are to us, short-lived, temporary. She even confessed as much to Himmel and the others before their parting after defeating the Demon King. 10 years to Himmel was a large percentage of his life, but 10 years for Frieren is nothing. And yet, she reflects grief at not only the passing of her companions, but also on the decision to not have spent more energy to know them. I have already done a video essay on grief. When talking about Spiritfarer, we discussed grief and some of the sociological approaches to the topic. I'll review some here, but not extensively. Historically, in Western academia, we have seen a growth in understanding grief, starting with something that was pathological and ending with something that is now highly discussed. While we are newly approaching things with a more full lens, we still have a lot to learn about grief and the ways we experience it. In Spiritfarer, we focused on the continuing bonds theory of grief. There are still aspects of continuing bonds in Frieren, though it is focused much more on the process of memorialization. During the period of time where we pathologized grief, grief was something to move on from. It was supposed to be hidden and then quickly moved past. We are now, however, in what has been dubbed spectacular grief, the time period in which hidden grief is removed and we are now free to discuss it. In fact, during spectacular grief, grief is not only free to be discussed, but is often discussed and takes over a lot of the conversation. Frieren fits well in this period of spectacular grief. It pivots grief to be the primary theme, and we get front row seats to see and hear what grief looks and feels like. While the sociology and anthropology of grief has a lot to learn and grow from its more problematic past, what it has shown us is that grief is not a simple process. It's not straightforward, it's not prescribed. Someone may go through the 5 stages of grief, but another may not, and that doesn't make their grief any less. It is simply different. Bereavement is not something which can be set up as something that we just tick boxes off as they come and go. It's not a diagnosis that comes with a prognosis. What we have learned through experiencing grief as well as studying it is that grief is something that is never finished. There's a saying in anthropology that is often used, constant state of becoming. This is something you hear a lot in a variety of spaces, and I think it encompasses grief as a constant state of becoming. But what does it actually mean when we say that? It means that we are constantly in a process of internalizing the experience and making it become a part of us. It's not one step, or even one time, moment, thing. It's something that is constant, continuous. We are never finished re-understanding, reanalyzing, and repersonalizing these experiences. Grief is not something you finish, but rather something that comes back again and again throughout your life in new forms and new understandings. In Frieren, grief and grieving is centered around memory. Frieren spends her time reflecting on her previous 10-year journey, re-experiencing, reanalyzing, and repersonalizing her experiences. Fresh context gives her fresh understandings of her companions, even those who have already passed. She also is able to reflect on how such a small amount of time impacted her life so drastically, even though she was unaware of it at the time. Throughout the story of Frieren, she gathers new companions to join her. She starts with Fern, a mage she is tricked into taking on as an apprentice by Hyder before he dies. Her other companion, Eisen, who is blessed with a longer life than humans, though not as long as Frieren, tried to train Stark, a fighter who is also a bit of a coward. The three begin to travel back up north, to an area near where the old Demon King's castle still stands. She's therefore retracing her steps, coming back to villages, towns, and cities she had visited so many decades before. Not only is she tracing her way through the same path, but her ultimate goal is to try and communicate with the dead. Therefore, the show, and Frieren as a character, has completely centered grief. She is constantly reliving, re-experiencing, recontextualizing her previous experiences, and seeing how the memory of the long past is still lingering into the present. This all being said, there is an important difference painted here. Not all memory is created equal. Frieren focuses so much on individual memory, Frieren's memory of her companions, or Fern remembering her foster father. But when the discussion of memory shifts to being about heroic deeds and a more national memory, this is seen as far less important. Himmel's memory is kept large as a hero. He's remembered fondly in many areas of the world, and statues of him are erected throughout the countryside as Frieren makes her way through. The statues, however, do not remind her of his great deeds, but rather of his personality. The memories most saved and cared for are those focused on simple acts and direct interactions with individual people. A mage Frieren meets, Werbel, confesses that growing up he admired Himmel for his great heroic deeds. However, his village spoke more of the small acts of care Himmel had performed for the individual people, simple things such as carrying heavy baskets. And it wasn't until his village was destroyed that he realized why this was the case. People don't have time to remember great heroic deeds when they are simply trying to live their life. These more simple memories are more of what carried Himmel. Frieren reflects on how Himmel insisted on doing these small acts of kindness, not to be remembered as a hero, but because it was just the right thing to do. Werbel reflects that these memories are important because they reflect how simple people are just wanting to live their life, and therefore grand exploits of heroic ventures rang less important than carrying heavy baskets for a merchant. In fact, Frieren as a show frequently shows us how heroic memory, the memory of great big deeds, was less important than those more centered on everyday life. Heroic memory is short-lived and dies out. When the cares and concerns of the world have moved beyond the evil that was taken care of, the memory of these great deeds also fall. In other words, the memory of heroes only lasts for as long as the reason to remember them lasts. But eventually, these things fade. We actually see this happen, not to Himmel, but to a reflection of someone who was once like Himmel. Frieren's party runs into another elf named Kraft. He is living on his own, also traveling around the world, exploring, adventuring. He speaks, though, of a time when people would have known his name. Later, Frieren encounters a statue of Kraft with a human companion. The villager who has asked for Frieren to clean the statue admits that both names have been forgotten, as well as the reason they had statues to begin with. Now they are just known as heroes, and nothing more. Kraft does not seem upset with this change. He sees it as a matter of life and the flow of memory. But this might be because he has his own memories of his time, his adventures, and his friend. Frieren points out this issue of heroic memory at the very end of the first season. Lernen, an old mage, was brought up to great prominence, but in a time of peace brought about by the defeat of the Demon King. He laments this era of peace because he was unable to create a legacy for himself. Frieren reflects on how childish this is. Instead, she talks about the people who care for him, and how these people love and cherish him, and these memories are what will move him forward. Memory of the great deeds are less important, they're less caring, and in many ways less real than the memories cherished by those dear to you. It also demonstrates how memory is short-lived, how life is temporary. Although those who love you and care for you carry your memory, they too will pass, and no legacy lasts forever. Frieren is, in many ways, the anime version of Shelley's Ozymandias. Large statues can be erected with great memory of your legacy, but nothing beside remains as the lone and level sands stretch far away. Frieren is loss. It's grief. It's about realizing and recontextualizing the things that you have lost. We can sit here and talk for ages about these things that we've lost, the people who are no longer around us, the lives that we are no longer living, the people no longer living them with us. We can talk about all these things, and we can reflect on how they affect us. But we also carry them in our memory, and we think about them, and we reflect on them, and we remember those who have left us behind and the lives we used to live. But Frieren teaches us more than this. It doesn't just teach us to remember or to cherish those memories. It doesn't just teach us about grief and loss. It teaches us about death, yes, but more importantly, Frieren teaches us to carry these things with us. It tells us that it's not about moving on, but about carrying things. It's not about just death, but it's about what it means to live.